that is voting methods, structures of government, campaign financing, etc., are better avenues for effecting change. That's the meta-constitutional level. Should we be focusing on how we set up our system itself rather than operating within the system? Thoughts?
I don't think it's an either or. I think you can have your finger in many pies. And just because you focus on making change at the meta level doesn't mean that you can't have opinions or be part of change at the already existing level. And often that sort of change, actually changing processes, for example, to allow minor parties to have a bigger share of the vote, that's very difficult to put through. Like, it's often harder than even getting change to happen directly. Because the people who are benefiting from the system, obviously they have an incentive not to change it. So I'd say, do a bit of both, but don't get your hopes up too much.
Yeah, I'd definitely echo that. And we do both in the Science Party. We write submissions to inquiries into the conduct of each federal election. And as I say, there's a lot of resistance to that. So just making it known that we are, we've got our eye on that, letting people know that we care a lot is one thing that we do.
And again, both sides of it. So I have two goals in my career essentially. One is to learn how to run organisations that are robust to changes in government but still efficient. And the other is to consider, down the line, how you reduce the impact of changes of government, potentially by having a better decision-making process at the head of our government. But that is a very, very hard to achieve goal, any sort of change to that decision-making process. So I think sometimes acting on the ground might be your better option in the near term at least.
So because I'm a very dull individual, I read a lot of political economics books, and oftentimes the author will spend the first half of the book explaining why it is impossible to change the system, and the system is broken, and why effective change is impossible, and then he spends the second half explaining how the system could be changed to be better. So there's sort of a flaw there, which is, well, yes, I think that you can't have enormous potential change. The scale, if you will, or the importance of changing the rules themselves is large. The tractability is very, very small. It's very difficult to change the system because you have to do so operating within the system itself. So that would be my input. That yes, it would be amazing if we could do that, but the idea of getting a constitutional amendment, which is what's required to make a lot of these big changes, is very, very difficult for a reason. All right. The next question we have: what possibility is there for working in policy to meaningfully help those without a vote? For example, young people, future populations, and non-humans. I think that's a very interesting question. All right, so I think I've been starting back and forth. So we'll start with Andrea and then move outward this time.
In that case, I think it's just a matter of sticking to your principles and being that voice for example, young people who can't yet vote. If that's, I guess there's a vested interest there for yourself to set up a system that benefits your future voters. But also you might just have that as one of your principles to make things better for everyone, even those who don't have a vote. And if I can just take this down a little policy path right now, that in Australia at the moment it definitely includes asylum seekers and refugees. Just putting that out there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Whoever wants to take it. Who has the best view?
Definitely.
Look at those angles. Oh, thanks. You accidentally made one mistake and you have to shave the whole thing off. It's living on the knife edge. Well, there's two things you can do. The first is you can make people care about the group that isn't represented by trying to make their issue fit into your world. So this is going to sound a bit horrible, but one of the best pro-refugee campaigns I've seen was one which portrayed the reality of life for refugee girls whose families thrown into chaos and instability by having like a white girl in a Western country, as if America got invaded or the UK got invaded, and suddenly they're stuck in a camp where people are fighting for food and stuff. And it's a shame that it has to come to that for people to empathize with other human beings or even non-human beings, but it's the reality, and sometimes you have to accept it. The other thing you can do is you can find out where the intersection is between the interest group that you care about and the one that you want to make care about them. So, for example, with veganism, for example, you can say the climate benefits. Animal agriculture is such a big part of our CO2 emissions, right? So, if people aren't able to, jump on board purely because of the, animal ethics issue. They might be pushed over the fence because they also care a lot about climate change. Similarly, you talk about people who can't vote, so 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds. Most old people have children or grandchildren. Make them think about their kids or their grandkids. You'll get even more support for the issue, more passionate support from the older people than from the kids that you represent.
I don't want to trivialize the act of making good policy, because that is incredibly hard, but often good policy is intuitively, obviously good policy. And that means it's not just in the interests of one group of stakeholders. If you can't think, is this good for the people who are unborn yet, the people who are living but don't have a vote, and the rest of the stakeholders, then it's probably been biased by lobbyists, by whatever special interest group is seeking that outcome. So I think everyone in this room is probably to some extent quite ethically balanced, broad circle of caring kind of person. And I think if you don't feel that policy is in the favour of everyone within your circle of moral concern, then you have reason to question it and reason to look into how it can be changed so that it does respect everybody within your circle of moral concern.
Yeah, so I guess I would say that the answer to this question is the same as how do you work in policy meaningfully at all? Because these are three groups that don't have a large voice in politics, but the fact is that most groups that most people are part of do not have a large voice in politics. There's very few groups that have their voice heard. And they're usually either very powerful, because, for example, labor unions are very powerful, big corporations are very powerful, money interests are very powerful, foreign governments are very powerful. But odds are any one of you individuals is a part of at least a half dozen different groups that isn't represented. So these groups aren't represented at all, but most groups that we are a part of are not represented. So the argument is much broader. I realize I'm not giving a great answer. I'm just saying that this is a problem with almost every policy that benefits any group. Representation is often very poor, and it's very specific. It's not very diffuse. It's a problem, and if I knew the solution, I'd be a much more successful consultant. All right, the next question I think is fantastic. What percentage of politicians' decisions are based on evidence versus what is popular? And I'll start off by saying that what is popular is a form of evidence. And perhaps it's overweighted, but it is a form of evidence, and I'll throw to the floor on that.
I feel like it was just caught on camera, and my facial expression in response to that question probably sums it up. I think it's embarrassingly high on anything that hits the media. There is room for reasoned debate in the back halls of government, but the moment something gets a light shone on it, people's character and the way they respond to things can completely change. And that's why I say be an active participant in the political system. Try to dull down the absurd edge voices and get things back on the topics that matter.
I'm well informed that there are a lot of backbenchers who do a lot of hard work and stay out of the limelight, and they just do their job that they're paid for, that they're voted in to do. Not showboating around. Sorry, just bring it back forward.
So how?
Evidence.
Yeah, evidence versus popular.
Evidence versus evidence other than how popular will this make you? I think that goes back to what I said about there being lots of government commissioned evidence generated. So we know that the evidence is there, and as we see, it's not always acted on. So I haven't quantified the evidence that gets ignored, but it's non-zero.
One of the biggest problems with the system that we have in this country is this whole thing of 3-year election cycles at the federal level. So, all the evidence might say that we need to make this urgent yet unpopular change happen now, but governments are too afraid because they know they'll get voted out in 1 or 2 years. It takes that's not enough time to bring people over to get them to, settle down a bit and deal with unpopular change. So I would, try to change that bit of the system at the meta level. The other thing is, having the evidence on your side is like playing Pokemon cards and having Charizard, right? It doesn't guarantee you're going to win, but you know that if you use it well enough, you have the advantage. So rather than giving up or getting frustrated that people aren't listening to the evidence, put it in a way that they'll actually listen to it. Use it strategically. You don't just assume that the evidence will solve the problem for you. And often that's a hard and a long-term process, but all the significant and radical change in this world for the better took a long time to happen. And don't give up. Just keep pushing.
I did also mean to say, if you don't mind, sorry, that when you've got the evidence on your side, it is the sad reality that the way a lot of things are reasoned at, at the moment, is when you've got the evidence behind you, then you still have to go in and make the emotional argument. But that's a lot easier when you know that you've got the evidence behind you.
I'd go one step further, though, to say also that evidence can't carry an argument. That evidence can only show you that a particular outcome is likely given a certain framing. That doesn't define the value structures that are why are we pursuing one outcome over the other. And so not letting politicians use the evidence to obscure the value structure they're actually driving at is a really important part of this. Is not saying, oh yeah, but the number backs it up, thinking, why is that number being framed in that way and what's it backing up in reality? Is it actually a good outcome or is it just a measurable, demonstrable outcome? What is the broader policy issue of question and what are we genuinely hoping to achieve?
So I'll finish up with this and we'll do one more question from the crowd this time. Just to address this evidence versus popularity, I think there's a huge problem, and that is, even if you know, let's say you have a magic oracle that tells you what the best policy is, you still might be powerless to achieve that as an elected official. And the reason is because you are not the only person making the decision. You are working in a complex environment with lots of other people who you need to agree not only on one issue, but every subsequent issue. You're playing a very long game. You're thinking, what do I need to do to get reelected so I can still make marginal change? What do I need to do to make other people like me so that in the future they will back me on issues I think are important? And what do I need to do to ensure that I'm actually advancing good policy? So as much as I like to bag on politicians, and I really, really do, they are faced with a very difficult game theoretic situation. That they're not just trying to do what's best, they're trying to do what's best given all of the possible future votes and interactions they might have. So while I'm all about giving them a hard time when they do the wrong thing, also understand that they may have to negotiate, they may have to vote against their better interests, what they think is right, simply because that will allow them to achieve a better long-term outcome. And that's why democracy is fatally flawed. And on that, let's move on to the last question. So the one hand in the back there that I think was raised right at the beginning. Sorry, I can't see your name tag, but pink jacket, can you stand up and ask the question?
Okay, sorry, because I dropped in late, so I
That's all right.
my name tag. So my name is Charlene. I'm a law student, and then because I study law, therefore I have a degree of understanding of how the system works. And my question is about the law, the effectiveness of law, and the effectiveness of the policy. So which one is more effective to change the way, like how the system runs, or to achieve a certain goal? Like, what do you guys think? That's my question.
Just to clarify, you mean the difference between legislative change and regulatory change? Is that what you're saying?
Because it's more like, so from my understanding, so law is more like a long-term prevention. So it's like we put the law here to prevent the future of the crime. So that's a way to stop the back impact. However, for the policy, it's more like a recently reaction to certain issues that are happening in this country. So I will see, maybe compared with law, I will see policy would be focusing more on the short-term impact, but maybe it's more effective in terms of change the issue we're facing now, like compared with law. That's my understanding. But because I want to know like how you guys think.
Without sort of devolving it into a undergrad lecture, like you've hit on the point that there is party policy, and then there is the policy of the government of the day, and then there is the policy that is enacted within the government. And often that is a legacy of the government of the previous day. It may have been a different party, but a lot of the policies that are actually enacted by government as it functions will be continuing on. And so changing the policy of the parties of the day can be hugely impactful because it can affect the legislative agenda, but you still have that issue that you can, have a legislative change that is actually far, far worse and far, far more lasting than a government policy change, which doesn't need quite so much investment and public will to follow through on. You can convince a minister and have a government policy change at the, operational level. Once you've put something into the legislation, it is, a much more fraught process to undo that change if you get anything wrong. So as you say, it's very valuable for those longer term. Society has progressed from this point, or the digital environment has changed, and we now need to actually deal with things completely differently. But legislation is a very blunt instrument sometimes.
Yeah, I feel there is a bias towards that reactive, at least in the media what we see, that reactive, we've got to make this change, terrorism, let's bring in this harsh national security law. But yeah, long-term thinking is something that's missing from our politics, but you also do make a good point, James, that putting in reforms like that have the potential to have the most impact, and they could be good or bad. And obviously, when it comes to a small party, where we can be pretty nimble when we find new evidence that points towards our policy aims to update the meat of our policy, but yeah, very little effect on Australian government policy.
I would say a policy is, I guess, the chance to really deal with the human element of how things actually play out. Often the law will just tell you what sort of powers, for example, are vested with a police officer, let's say. It won't often give directives on how to exercise those powers in an ethical and an effective manner. So sometimes you're more realistic, really just focusing on the policy part rather than trying to convince a bunch of politicians who've never, been on a police beat in their life how the police should be doing their job. So, for example, under the law, public intoxication is technically illegal. Yet, would you encourage the police to go out there and arrest every single person having a goon bag in front of the house? Right? I mean, they're not causing harm to anyone, right? And it's going to take up a ton of police resources. You're going to chuck people into jail with hardened criminals. And unfortunately, this actually does happen in Indigenous communities. A kid gets arrested for offensive language or something, and suddenly they get thrown into lockup with people who are actual thieves and drug dealers. And then it becomes a cyclical problem. So I think sometimes you can actually make a much bigger difference to people's lives if you're there at the policy level where you can have some influence with that.
So I'm going to use a metaphor. I'm going to change the metaphor, given that this is an effective altruism group. But there's more than one way to skin a potato. And what I mean by that is that and I may not be answering this question, but that's chair's privilege. I can answer whatever question I want. There's multiple ways to achieve change in any given area. For example, if you had an issue with the way that the Payment Systems Board was running things, it's an obscure sub-branch of the Reserve Bank. There's multiple things you can do. You could go to the Reserve Bank and you could go through their avenues and try to change the Payment Systems Board opinion. You could also go to Parliament and attempt to lobby politicians to change what the Payment Systems Board actually is and remove it from the Reserve Bank and set it up under parliamentary oversight. Alternatively, you could start a grassroots campaign and try and get people to be motivated to then go to their parliamentarians to then remove the Payment Systems Board from the Reserve Bank. So there's lots of different ways of approaching this, and that one of the early stages of any policy change campaign has to be identifying who you want to actually influence. Do you need to influence the bureaucrats? Do you need to influence the policymakers? Or do you need to influence the other people in the community who will then go downstream and influence all those other people? So that is a question that I don't necessarily have a good answer to, because it's probably case dependent. I'm also going to conclude here with a self-indulgent remark that I think these sorts of talks are only useful if you use the knowledge you get from it. So I hope you enjoyed your evening, I really do, but I hope also you found something you can take away. And if that thing you take away is it's not useful to affect policy change, that's okay, because that's still an information update. But please try and think, if you can take anything away from this and it will affect your behavior in the future, it's been a successful event. Even if that is look up more and learn more information. So thank you again to all of our speakers. And thank you very much for coming. We're going to go and just have a little fun session now for the rest of the evening. We're getting kicked out of here in half an hour. We have some group norms that you should all try and abide by. Humility and honesty, inclusion, helpfulness, openness, agreeableness, resource sharing, and safety and comfort. I won't go into those details because I think they're self-explanatory.
In the name of inclusion, I'd also like to thank Austen for his fantastic chairperson.
It's always my pleasure to talk at people and setting where they can't interrupt me. And so please just be kind to one another in the networking session. Thank you for coming again. There's some resources up here, easydney.org. You can learn more about this group and come to our meetups, as well as some other things about effective altruism more generally. And I included some speakers' websites for the Taxpayers Alliance and Science Party.